Hello everyone, we are live. Unfortunately, we are with crazy people today, so we will see how that goes. Maybe we get to some of these issues here. Um, let's start with this one here. Steve, do you want to talk about it?
Sure, thanks. So we took a look at this a week or so ago and brought it back to cycle on it internally. So with the cloud native team and ASP.NET, we kind of came up with this approach. It completely spells out all of the lifecycle events. We originally were only interested in this starting, the first one here. In the end, we decided for consistency and for future just to have one interface with the before and after events for starting and started. And then also this interface derives from iHosted service, which has the start async and stop async. So the intent is if you need these services, you derive from this new interface and you implement the ones you need. And then there's the timeout down below for startup. That was there last time as well. One note is that this interface is not a registered interface. You don't call get service on it. It's essentially just for the author to implement these four methods. iHosted service, however, is a is registered interface. I mean, your type is registered with that. So you don't call get service on this new interface. There's no reason to directly call these methods, since the framework will call them for you, or the host will call them for you.
And then if you have an older host, it just doesn't call them. So if you use like 7.0 abstraction, or sorry, 8.0 abstractions and 7.0 of the host.
Right.
That is weird, but I don't know how you'd fix that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't either. We tried to fix similar problems with the keyed services ahead, but yeah, I don't know how you do here. It might just be we have to live with it. I just clarifying.
Should background service implement this?
I think the thinking on how it was background service should probably implement this and use the started async instead of start.
Yeah.
I was also wondering, do we want to add application starting to application lifetime? Because there's this nice symmetry, except for that. Like all of these methods, except for starting, are cancellation tokens on the application lifetime interface. So I guess that's harder because you wouldn't want to do a derived interface for that.
Are these dimmable?
They are net standard 2.0 or
So no.
net standard something.
Yeah. And framework.
Do they have to be?
I think so.
Yeah, they do. For now.
Because I mean, another design option would be to just make all these four methods dims on iHosted service and just no op them, right? Because they're basically just callbacks, right? Events. But yeah, if you want them in Net Center too, then I guess this is the design you have.
I'm wondering what the behavior is when these methods hang. So like if you block stopping or stopped or started, that blocks forward progress for other services and for the host itself, right? That was the issue we have with start. When you called start was supposed to not return until your thing was done starting. And background service did a weird thing where it did a task.run in start to avoid blocking the starting. But if you want to actually, what was it, fail startup? No, I guess that doesn't change anything here. Still the same behavior.
Yeah,
We're
because
blocking these block other people, right? Yeah.
well, you could imagine that if someone were trying to avoid blocking the start method, then they could also implement this new interface and then have started async return
Yeah.
a task that is tied to whatever background work they kicked off. So I think the design's flexible enough to allow for that.
Who's supposed to await these things?
The host when you call start async or stop async. So the host calls it sub-hosted services. I had a question, sorry. So these all follow the concurrency thing that was added in .NET 8.2, right? So each of these methods will run in parallel if you have that option set on host options.
The proposal is that these automatically run in parallel. Start async is separate, and it uses the new setting.
Oh, so these don't follow the new setting; they just run in parallel.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because first of all, these are new methods, and in general, if you can run in parallel for async work, which is typically going to be beneficial for running that way, that we should try to, I think, use that model. So I would expect people to try to move start. I expect people to try to use the new option that was added in 8.0 to run start and stop concurrently as well. It was primarily added for stop because of shutdown issue timeouts. Yeah. So it will be confusing, and we talked internally about, we have to dock this appropriately, that these four methods are going to run concurrently. And start and stop may or may not run concurrently, depending on the flag for that or the option for that, or for those two.
So when you say concurrently, you mean multiple implementations of this interface will have their method call at the same time, but within one component, there's no concurrency, right?
Say that last sentence again.
So a given implementation of iHosted Lifecycle service, there's no concurrency between methods, right? It's just that multiple different hosted lifetime services will have their started and starting be called concurrently.
Right. These are stages, and all starting async implementations will run together at the same time.
Okay.
And then start may or may not, depending on the option, and then started will run after start is done. So it depends on the host and things like that, whether started gets called, that sort of thing. But the idea is that these are async methods, and they're different than this application lifetime interface that we have, which are synchronous. So, typically when you do sync stuff, well, I'm just going to stop there before I go down this hole. But yeah, these are new layers, and each one runs before the next, and every implementation of these, which is going to be very few, are expected to be very few, are going to run concurrently for performance. And if there's any kind of dependencies between them, that has to be managed by the application, and there's a few different ways that they can do that.
Right. So what you said earlier about that these are new methods and we can have different semantics for those, I can kind of buy that, but it does seem weird that start async and then these methods have different behavior. Also, do we think we might eventually end up in a world where we want people to be able to turn off concurrency? Because if that's the case, then you're probably better off keying all of them off of the same property.
I think this is kind of one of those usability questions that say, hey, originally we decided that we're going to run them in a series, like start async would be run in a series, still asynchronously, that sort of thing, but in series and not in parallel or concurrently. And that was just a decision made a while ago. And do we want to keep on using that same decision when we know that there's cases that people want to have parallelism? So it's especially for these new methods, because they're going to do things like background validation and things like that. So they may want their existing start method, which there probably should only be one implement. I'm going to say there probably should only be one implementation of that. That's actually long running. Anyway, I think that having that, not using that new option for these new methods does make sense. But we could key it off of that. In the end, someone might then want individual control so that they can run the start method synchronously for backwards compatibility, and then run the new ones in parallel. If that makes sense. So I think if we follow all or have all of them use the same setting, there might be some consumers that want to have different settings for the new methods versus the existing one, or the existing two, start and stop.
So I asked, about this, and it wasn't what I expected, but I think it's fine. By default, hosted services run serially for start and stop async. That's existing behavior for people who really want ordering of their on services. Those they continue using those methods. This is for libraries and stuff that really want to initialize something before start or something. This still does that, right? Like each part of the life cycle is still serialized, though things within the life cycle are concurrent. I think that's okay.
There's a little caveat in that if you look at the sample down below, you're unlikely to implement all 4 of these methods. Probably only going to implement one of them. And so you're just going to return the completed task for each of these, which is a no-op. So what we plan on doing for performance is, instead of calling task.run to run everything concurrently, including the no-op ones, we will call these synchronously in series, the order that they're registered. And as soon as the first await is encountered, we're going to grab that return task and then run those in parallel. So there's actually, if the method is synchronous and doesn't do anything asynchronous, you actually do run in series. It's just if you have an actual await, or something truly async, then we just turn it over to test.run. Without that, I think that the performance impact was measured locally, was about 55 times overhead of this approach versus calling task.run on no ops.
I think it's fine. I don't think it needs to be the highest performance thing, but I think not calling task.run is fine. And yeah, to your point, for some things that gives you serialization if you want it.
So then are you okay with the shape here as proposed?
The thing I'm the saddest about is that, like, if I take a dependency on Microsoft Extensions Hosting Abstractions 8, and then someone's still using like the old host, it just won't work. If I add a I-hosted service that implements these lifecycle service methods, but I don't have a better alternative, so I would say just approve it at the moment.
Yeah, and I would say as a kind of a crappy workaround is that someone can implement some of these other like let's say that they're not interested in start or stop, but they're implementing starting or started. They can actually see if start was called or not, just by a simple bool or whatever. And then if starting wasn't called or stopping wasn't called, then they at least can detect that if they want to and throw some exception or have some alternate, behavior. But that would be up to the author to do that, not really helped by anything the host does.
Levi?
The only other comment I had was a startup timeout should be -1, not 0. If you're intending it to be infinite timeout.
Okay, I didn't know there was a convention for that.
Yeah, it's you can actually use timeout.infinite timespan, which will return a time span wrapping -1 milliseconds. The thing is, if you have a time span of 0 and you try wrapping a cancellation token around it, the cancellation token will immediately trip.
Yeah, so the semantics of the prototype anyway, it just detects a 0 value and doesn't, add that extra link cancellation token.
I think it should be -1 though, or time span dot infinite or whatever. Timeout dot infinite.
Yeah, timeout.infinite timespan or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. And then just like record keeping note. Do we normally note when things are in different assemblies? Because host options is in the extensions hosting assembly, and the interfaces and abstractions. I think they're both in the same namespace though.
I did note that in the description.
Yeah, you did. I was just wondering if that's something we typically noted in the approval message.
I think we generally point it out unless it feels super relevant to something along the lines of this will only be available in net 8 and this part is available in net standard.
Someone in YouTube chat I'm seeing on screen is like, it's weird to use infinite for something that's not infinite, but it is infinite, right? Like by default, like that's the point. There's no startup timeout by default.
And honestly, I think that the implementation will just detect that value and not go through the extra work of creating that cancellation token. Just use it as a flag, and not
right.
really hook it up.
So we ready to approve then?
Yeah, I'm good with it, personally.
I mean, the host issue that you pointed out, Stefan, is I think is a general problem with forwards compatibility. That's just an unsolvable problem.
Wait, so the next proposal, sometimes we can kind of try to solve it, but yeah.
All right, who wants to talk about this?
I can.
Howdy ho.
So this proposal is to add keyed services, keyed dependency injection. Basically, it's an ask both internal and external, and we think like .NET 8 is a good target for that. So basically, every service can be accessed via a service key plus the service type like we have today. So for that, we'll need to modify the service descriptor to add the service key and add 3 new getter, basically, to get like the implementation instance or the implementation type or the implementation factory that we already have today. But here it's only for KID service descriptor, if that makes sense. This service key object will always be null for non-KID services, so all the services that we have today. Yeah, I don't know if I have any question here or I'm going too fast.
So I think history might be kind of useful because you're just talking about the abstractions for
Yes.
derived class incompatibility. I think the original proposal is the factory only, but we added the keyed implementation type and keyed implementation instance. Basically, so a keyed service could never be misinterpreted as a non-keyed service by like an older service provider.
Yes, that's what I tried to write just before, but yeah. Basically, if a container builder try to access like implementation instance, if the service key is not null, you will get an exception. That way, you should never be able to build a container that doesn't support KID services if you registered KID services before. And so to register this descriptor, we will need to add several extension methods. If you can scroll down, there is a lot of them.
So service descriptor doesn't exist yet? Or
No, it does exist. Yeah, sorry, it already exists. I just added this 1, 2, 3, 4 property, and the 5th is just a helper method.
So to be clear, right, there aren't that many other properties. The other properties are service type, right? So the type you resolve. And then there are non-keyed versions of like the other 3 properties that are exactly the same, except for the func is slightly different.
Yes, in my current PR that is open, they are backed by the same member, basically. The getter are just wrapper around them. So it should not add memory space. And so to add this KID service descriptor, I added a bunch of helper method. So it's basically all the helper methods that exist for non-KID, but for KID services.
Which type are these extension methods on?
It's on a new, in my PR, it's currently on a new class, that's a static class that is in, everything is in the, unless I'm mistaken, everything is in the like dependency injection namespace.
That makes sense.
Quite flat. And it's, for now, I put everything in a new static method. I don't know why I didn't put it in the issue, but it's basically, what's the name?
It's a good question, though. I commented about this on the PR. I think these should go along with their non-keyed method. Like, I think they should, I don't think we need new classes for these.
Yeah, especially if they're all in the namespace. So, in generally speaking, with extension methods, if you put them on new types in the same namespace, like the IntelliSense experience is virtually the same, unless people invoke them via static invocation syntax, which nobody does, right? So, I mean, the only reason to put it on a different type is if you want that type to live in a different namespace, in my opinion. Otherwise, you might as well add it to the existing type.
Here.
My only concern is that it's already like a 500 lines file with a lot of methods. I'm fine if we want to merge everything in the same class, but I felt it was
partial classes with multiple files.
I'm okay with that.
Yep, I'm okay with that. Otherwise, it will be a mess to review, honestly. It's already
They are
hard to
very
review.
similar to their non-keyed counterparts, though. So I almost like having them together for reference, too. But yeah.
But note that I had to add the KID keyword in all the methods to avoid like a clash between some of the helper method.
I like the clarity too, regardless.
Yes, I think it's better that way too. And next, I think I call about any key registration. If you can scroll down a bit.
Scroll further, or is that? Oh,
Yes, there is a lot of method. Yeah, the any key registration. So basically what we want is a catch-all registration. So if you register a service with kidservice.anyKey, every time you try to get a service that was not explicitly registered with a given key, you will get this registration. Basically here in the sample, you see that S1, you will get other service because it was explicitly registered with other service. But for S, it should be S2. If you use any other key, and here it's string, but it can be anything you want, you will default. You will get the default service. And of course, this works with all the overload, like for lifetime. Like it can be a singleton, it can be transient, it can be etc. And
I noticed we just scrolled past this remove all keyed method. Do we need that? We don't have anything like that, right? Do we have remove all? Does this already exist?
Yes.
Oh, never mind.
Okay. That's why I wanted two different files. It was easier to just duplicate everything, to be honest.
Yep.
Well, yeah, they are very similar. I think the partial is a nice middle ground.
Yeah.
Sorry, the one thing I don't understand is the way you can retrieve these keyed services only via method invocation? There's no constructor injection, for example, because you have no way to specify the key?
Yes, you have. You have to scroll down a bit. If you go in resolving service, I think, yeah, the first thing I talk is you can get keyed service, basically like in the previous sample, where you can pass the service key as an object. I try to be consistent and always get the service type first, then the service key, then for injection, the service implementation type. And I added several extension methods. Like they are in a separate class, but I think I will do the same strategy as for the collection extension, and add it to like transfer the existing class to a partial class and add them to a partial class. Basically, all the method needed to retrieve a keyed service from the provider. If you try to call this extension method on a container that does not implement the I support keyed service, it will throw.
Is there a downside to just putting is service in I support keyed service? Is there any time that anyone would implement one without the other?
That's a good question.
Because I think like in legacy we made it a separate interface, but like for this it's like
I think you're right. Yeah, I just followed what we did for legacy and didn't. Yeah, I think we can merge it too.
Is the name I support keyed service based on inserting keyed into an existing I support service?
Yeah, sorry? I support required service is the beginning of this pattern, if you will. But now that's combining a bunch of different methods, I think we have some freedom.
Well, because support keyed service doesn't sound like a reasonable name for a class. Therefore, I support keyed service doesn't sound like a reasonable name for an interface.
Yeah, I know it goes against guidelines. But yeah, the start of this convention, so to speak, is I support required service, I believe.
Yes.
Okay.
We also have I service, provider is service.
Yeah, for this one, we could call it is keyed service. I agree. So should we remove the support from the I support kid service and just call it I kid service provider or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And then if you do that, it's like, should it also derive from iService provider? I mean, it could.
Maybe someone want to implement. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe.
I don't quite know what the interfaces are supposed to solve, honestly. Like, so what is the? So the idea is the first one is only for cases where people would want to have the existing semantics, but without supporting keyed services.
So, sorry.
Yeah, we don't want. We cannot break backward compatibility. We have existing containers that only support like the non-kid service provider thing. So that's why I added a new interface for that. If that was your question.
So the extension methods below too are on iService provider will cast to this.
Yes. It will check if the current iService provider is capable of casting to iSupport kit service. If not, it will throw an invalid operation exception.
Isn't that a good reason for this new interface to derive from iService provider?
I think that's fine. Yeah, I think we probably should.
Yep, I think we can.
Because it's not like you can implement it on two different classes if we're just doing the casting.
Yeah, no, I think it's reasonable to.
And is
You can
iService
also
provider
have it implement iSupports required service, and iService provider is service. Like if we're going to the natural conclusion, you could say this is basically the interface that means you implement all the features that our service provider does in .NET 8, if you wanted to.
But then if we in .NET 9, we add a new interface and we will have again this issue.
Yeah, I think having it derived from iService provider is enough.
So is this the regular system iService provider, or is it something that's specific to you guys?
The regular one.
Yeah, extending that one is a non-option, I think. I mean, sorry, deriving from that is fine, but extending it with DIMS is a non-starter, I think.
For sure, I think.
For your other question, Stefan, like iService provider is service. We don't do the cast for that one. We ask the service provider for the service.
Yep.
iService provider is service. So that's the difference, I guess. Like that's why keyed support service or whatever we're going to call this new interface, it shouldn't derive from that.
Oh yeah. You're right. I mean, that's fair. Because you're right. Like for everything else, you just resolve it as an iService provider and use the extension methods.
Right, because there you can actually implement it on two different classes, right? Because your service provider gets called for get service of this thing. It doesn't. We don't do the cast.
Yeah,
which kind of begs the question: should we do the same thing here? Is the cast the right thing, or is it? Should we be calling service provider get service for the keyed service? Do you know what I mean?
I think we could. I don't know if there is any perf issue with that.
Sorry, I'm not sure I follow exactly. So what's the proposal?
So there's no proposal. I'm just asking the question. We have iService provider is service today, right?
Yep.
And we don't cast the iService provider to that interface.
Right, we resolve it.
Right, we say service provider, we say provider dot, give me the service for that interface.
Yep.
I'm not 100% sure why we did it that way, but the question,
people from the community asked for it because they didn't want to implement it basically with their container, and they're like, we can put something in the container. But anyway, sorry.
So the question is, should we follow that same pattern with this new interface and not cast, but instead ask the service provider for this? The interface is named I support keyed service today, so I'm going to just call that. That's what I'm going to use, the new interface. Because if we don't do the cast, then the new interface shouldn't derive from my service provider. And if we do the cast, it makes more sense for it to derive from iService provider.
Yeah, it is kind of annoying how there's two different patterns for like required services and is service.
Is there any perf? Like, do we fear to lose performance every time we try to get a kit service that we'll have to first get the iSupport service? I think both are fine to me. I don't really like the cast, to be honest, but maybe it's leaner that way.
The cast will be faster.
Yep.
Whether it'll matter or not, that I don't know.
I think as much as possible, we should like just be following the same pattern that we do for the non-keyed counterpart, which means as casting for the required thing and putting it in the container for the is service thing. Because you're right, like people will expect to be able to construct or inject this like iService provider is service keyed. And then you could argue that should probably derive from iService provider is service then. Maybe not.
No, I think if we get it by the service provider, it should be separate. Everything should be separate.
It could be separate.
That way. Yep.
Interface segregation, all that, and people are, yeah, okay.
Yeah, let's keep them separate. Let's not do any deriving.
Yeah, let's just keep them all separate. We haven't, again, with consistency with what we've already done. So are we just going back to the original proposal? I think.
Yeah, a separate interface for get required kit service then.
That would be the original proposal. I mean, I don't know if that's necessary. Because at least get required keyed service and get keyed service work the same way. Like it's just extension methods as casting. So those are definitely more similar. When I said go back to the original proposal, I meant go back to what's on the screen.
Yeah.
As opposed to any of the suggestions.
I think it's better to keep them separate, just in case someone wants to implement them separately, maybe. But maybe getting iSupport kit service from the service provider is better. It's cleaner that way.
So one upside to separating them is that we can do like what we do today with iSupport required service, right? So if you are lazy and you want to just implement iSupport keys service, you can get like the required thing kind of for free, right? With the null check and the extension method. If you don't want to do any special logic to make better exception messages, which is I think the original motivation. So you said, Ben, that you would prefer to separate the get keyed service and get required key service?
Yeah, I think it's better to follow the existing pattern.
All right. I suggested merging in the PR. Sorry for making more work, but I'm okay with it. Like if that's what you prefer.
So in 3 interfaces then?
Yeah. I mean, I don't feel strongly one way or the other. I don't think it's bad as on screen either.
I'm fine with what's on screen.
I'm fine too with what's on screen to be. So we can keep it like that. So first question, should we change the name and drop the support from the interface name?
So the thing is, you won't be able to constructor inject the iSupport keyed service. So if you called it like iKeyed service provider, people might expect that you could. And it is like consistent with the naming of iSupport required service, but
it's kind of weird for it not to have service provider in the name, because that's what this thing is, right? It's an iService provider for keyed services.
all right, yeah, all right, I'm fine with it. It's just the only downside that I see is if you take an iKeyed service provider in your constructor, it's gonna like fail, right? It's not gonna find it unless we want to say that's also something you have to support. We could make that a new convention, right, for keyed service providers, that you can just like constructor, like this is now something you can constructor inject just like iService provider. Or you can say just use the extension methods. But
I don't think people will use the iSupport kit service interface directly. Yeah.
especially with its current name. Yeah, I don't think they'll use it either way. I think the iSupport in a weird way kind of shows its internalness-ishness, or like kind of that it's an implementation detail. But I'm okay with the other name, even if it won't be constructor injectable. So iKeyed service provider.
So let's keep the name as is then.
I was gonna be fine with iKeyed service provider, and iKeyed service provider is service, but I'm also fine with what it is because the way most people interact with it are these extension methods.
Yes, exactly.
And injecting the iService provider is service keyed. I guess that is used directly.
Okay, so second interface should be injected. Okay.
Just because that's what you do with iService provider is service, right?
So I'm confused. Are we changing the name of the interface or not? We keep it iService provider is service keyed.
If no one responds in 3 seconds, we keep it as is.
Okay.
Yes. So my thought is, if we're renaming iSupport keyed service to iKeyed service provider, then iKeyed service provider is service makes a little more sense. But otherwise, just keep both names as is.
So why don't we like iKeyed service provider?
I'm fine with it.
It feels like that's the natural name for this thing.
I would agree with that.
If we name it that way, we'll need to inject it in the container so people can get it from a constructor, for example. I think that's what Stefan's point.
You wouldn't have to. Some people might expect that, but I'm not sure how many.
And you say that because its service provider currently is injected and anything named service provider should be injectable? Is that what you're saying?
Kind of. Yeah, basically. Just as like, yeah. I mean, it doesn't obviously have to be that way, but people might think that, hey, if I can inject an iService provider, why can't I inject an iKeyed service provider?
I mean, it seems reasonable to inject it. I mean, and there's no downside to doing that, right?
If it doesn't implement iService provider, it's kind of a pain because then you could only get keyed service. Like the easier way to use it, like the less pit of failure way, is just like inject the iService provider and use all these extension methods we made for you.
I mean, you can do that too, right? I mean, that's kind of how the system works now.
And if we like publicize more this iKeyed service provider interface, we will need to duplicate all the extension method too, right?
Yeah, I think it's
Why would we need to duplicate?
Because basically you will need like something that returns T and takes like a T generic parameter and stuff like that. That's what I meant.
It would derive from iService provider, so it would get all the extension methods, but yeah, I'm on the fence about this. Keyed service provider. I think we could start off by just saying, no, you can't inject it. You just have to inject it as an iService provider, and we'll see what people think of it. We could always improve things later, you know, by making it injectable if people want that. But if we do name it that, it should definitely derive from iService provider or implement iService provider.
And also, I think I already said this. There is a question, 2 questions in the chat about the service key, like ordering parameters. I tried to be consistent with what was existing. So first is the service type, then the service keys, then the implementation type. I did that because on the extension method, when you are using the generic parameter, it's always the service type that is the first one. So.
Yeah, I think type then key makes sense. Yeah, so if you're asking for votes, I think my vote is, you know, call the thing I keyed service provider implements iService provider is not constructor injected, and then name iService provider is service key, just I keyed service provider is service, and otherwise keep it separate for.
So I said the last part again. What would you propose to call this interface?
So first one, I keyed service provider. Second one, I keyed service provider is service.
I see. That makes sense, yeah.
And I think the method should be called isKeyed service.
Yeah.
And not iService. Okay, so we can continue to resolving via attributes.
I guess the last question I have, especially since we're renaming, is services. Should I keyed service provider is service implement I service provider is service? Like if you want to check for both, or do I need to inject those separately? I think it probably should, right?
No, yeah, you should inject both separately anyway.
Oh, you think it should be separate?
Yep.
Okay. All right, I'm fine. I'm just like imagining the code that typically uses this thing, like request delegate factory and stuff, and it's gonna need both, right? Because as soon as you like add attributes that support keys.
How much more is there to this issue after what's currently on the screen?
It's a lot.
There's the attributes for one.
Yeah, the attribute I think is pretty important to talk.
Well, then it sounds like this is being continued to Thursday.
Yeah, everyone out of time. We have only 5 minutes left, and I think some of us have a hard stop at 12. So I mean, basically, so far, I mean, it seems like we will approve it, right? We have basically notes for the first 5 things. Is there anything to say about the attributes, or can we just take them as is?
I mean, you can always bike sheds and attributes. Those are probably some of the most visible things. But yeah, like, do we like starting it with from for the from keyed services and so forth?
I mean, it looks pretty straightforward to me.
I think it's pretty straightforward, but I think one disagreement that we had with Stefan is So the key is an object. We don't have any restriction on that. But then you see on the service, when you inject the key with the service key attribute, it's a string. So the container will have to check that the type of the key match the type of the parameters in the constructor.
Right.
Ben sold me on the object key though, so I'm fine. I'm not going to push back on that.
Is there any case when it's not a string?
Yes, it can be any object you want.
In the
As
any
long-
key, oh sorry,
Yeah.
is not a string, and that's a default or a built-in key.
Yes, because some people want to use enum, some people want to use type, some people may want to use like custom object. As long as the keys that you are using correctly implement equals and get hashcode, you're fine. And there is another attribute from key services attribute that is basically here to mark the parameter of the constructor that, okay, for service 1, I want the service 1 that was registered with the key service 1. And same for service 2.
Yeah, keep in mind this only works for literals, but yeah, you probably know that. That's what I was asking, is somebody ever using something that's not a string? Because it seems like it's the most desirable key.
Enums and typo can both be literal or attribute literals.
Yeah, ins as well. If you really want to go down that path.
In our ins, we use type directly.
I
You
use
don't
types.
have to use the attribute, right? Like if you use the get keyed service method, you could pass in anything.
Yes.
So then
And
this,
the attribute is not sealed, so people could pass custom object with that. Like basically the attribute will hide the object that you use as a key for your service. If I don't think it's clear what I meant, but let's
So
say
you're
you
looking at all parameter attributes and you're doing a runtime test to see if it corresponds to the one that you want?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
So someone could inherit from the from-kit service attribute thing and take 2 strings, for example, and then use the tuple as the key. So it will be easier to use in the constructor, for example.
So with these extension methods to iService collection, were the things copied all from the same class? Weren't they from like 2 or 3
There is
different classes?
2 different classes, one
Okay.
add and the other try add.
Right. So I think they should just go in the same class that their non-keyed counterpart is. Otherwise, like this actually looks pretty good to me. I think I would be pretty okay with approving it. Other than like I think from keyed services attributes like a little wordy, but it's clear. So like unless people have other input, like I don't know that there is a whole lot more to talk about. I mean, I guess maybe you could explain what the any key does, but yeah, I know people have a hard stop.
let's approve it for now, and then if somebody has change requests afterwards, we can still accommodate those.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Alrighty,
All right,
then I see the rest of you on Thursday. Bye bye.